in today's lecture, we're going to be covering chapter 16, and it is called Organizational Structure and Change. Let me share my screen and then we'll just jump right in. We're going to look at how businesses are built and how they adapt. So the two main ideas are organizational structure, which is how companies are set up, and then organizational change, how companies evolve over time. So the learning outcomes for this chapter. First, we're going to look at different organizational structure and what they look like and why they matter. We're going to dig deep into mechanistic versus organic structures specifically, so that you understand those definitions well. And then we're going to break down dimensions of change, how big or small it can be, and how it impacts different levels of the company. And then finally, we'll talk about how managers deal with change. And we're going to include some of the most famous models that are covered in the chapter. So hopefully by the end of this particular lecture and after reviewing the chapter material, you'll be able to see how structure and change actually work hand in hand and why adaptability is so important for managers and for organizations, especially to ensure that long-term success. So to understand organizations, first we need to talk about what organizational structure and design is. So organizational structure is like the blueprint of a house. It shows how everything fits together. I don't know if any of you have ever looked at like an org chart, how a company kind of works together. Maybe it could be your own company's org chart, or like if you just Google like Fortune 500 companies and what their org structure looks like. Some of them get crazy big, but the idea is that you have kind of how everything is set up to work together, how everything fits together, and think of it like a big puzzle. So in a business, that structure defines who does what, who reports to who, and how information flows up and down, from CEO level to people on the ground, people who are interacting with customers every day. So think of like maybe there's a new law that impacts the company and the CEO wants to communicate that with all of the staff at the lower level. So how does that communication happen? So as an example, we could have like a retail store. The sales associates report to the shift manager, and then the shift manager reports to the store manager, and then the store manager responds to maybe like regional leadership. And so everyone has like someone who they report to. So think about who you report to at your particular, company or firm, wherever you work. But without that structure, a company would be chaotic, right? Like, how would you know who to go to? It would be just all over the place. It's like being on a team, like think of a basketball team. Everybody has their position and their goal, and everybody communicates. Everybody knows what their position is to achieve the goal of winning, right? Imagine if there were like a football team or a basketball team where all the players chased the ball, like no matter where they were, and didn't have like that strategy or that structure. It would just be chaos. So structure really does make a difference and it matters. So these are some org charts that were in the book. And this is an example of a formal versus informal org chart. So you can see here how you have the formal one on the left, you have the CEO at the top, and then you have the VP of development, VP of operations, VP of sales. And then underneath those titles, you'll see who reports, who reports to them. You have for the VP of operations, you have admin. For VP of sales, you have a salesperson. And then you have these team leads with developers that report to the VP of development. So it's very well organized. It has a good flow. The CEO has people that report to him, but he doesn't necessarily have to be, in contact with all the developers because there's a team dedicated to that and a VP dedicated to that group. On the right, you have an informal org chart, and you can see how it doesn't necessarily, especially for smaller businesses, they can have an informal one that works for them, but it works because it's small. But the bigger an organization gets, the harder it is to maintain, when there isn't like a very, very structured organization in place. That organizational structure ultimately drives the success of the company when it does get to those, large levels of thousands of employees. You have to have some order to the chaos. And so these are just two examples that are in our book. Now let's look at the types of formal organizational structures. So there's one of the most common ones that I'm sure we've all heard of is called the bureaucratic model. You've heard people refer to like government, like, oh, it's a bureaucracy. And what that really means is that there's rules and procedures and hierarchies. It's very stable, it provides that stability, but sometimes it really slows things down. And so that's why you always hear like, oh, bureaucracy, because it takes a long time to do things. And it's stable, but that time, the slowing of things, that's what people get annoyed about when it comes to that bureaucracy. With specialization, that is the degree to which people are organized into subunits according to their expertise. So it just means that people focus on specific tasks. So you can think of like human resources, finance, marketing, or manufacturing. So as an example, in an assembly line, you can have one person that attaches a car door, and then another one that installs the engine, and another one that paints the car. And so this allows like efficiency, but it can create silos because these people are, working in their very own a part of the bigger picture. So workers may get so focused on their tasks that they don't see the bigger picture, and sometimes seeing that bigger picture is very important. A hospital is another good example. You have doctors, nurses, and administrative staff that each specialize in their field. But if they don't talk to each other, the patient experience suffers, right? The hospital doctors see one piece of it, and maybe they see an area where efficiencies can be created and communicate that to somebody who might not understand what it's like to be on the ground, with the patients, like an administrator. And so that communication is really key. The next element to consider is the reporting and oversight. That the reporting and oversight structure of the organization, like the command and control. Command and control refers to the way in which people report to one another or how they connect to coordinate their efforts in accomplishing the work of the organization as a whole. And then there's other structural choices. There's span of control. This is how many people a manager directly supervises. So it could be three, five, you want to be able to make sure that the manager that is assigned to that particular group is appropriate for the amount of people that that person is in charge of overseeing. Then you have the narrow span, and that means really close supervision. A wide span means managers oversee many people and employees work more independently. And then you have centralization. Should decisions be made by top leaders or delegated down to local managers? Walmart, for example, has some centralized decisions like national pricing, but it also decentralizes decisions like what products or stock to carry that's like local. And then there's formalization, and that's about rules. Should everything be written down, or can employees figure things out as they go? So organizations have to make choices about structure, how they're going to set themselves up for success. And it really depends on the organization, the industry, all of that plays a role in determining which structural design to adopt. So now let's jump into talking about mechanic versus organic structures. A mechanic structure is rigid, it's formal, it's strict, it's rule-based. Think of McDonald's. Every Big Mac is made exactly the same way, whether you're in California, New York, Mexico, China. And that consistency is only possible because there's very specific rules, there's a clear chain of command, and then an organic structure, on the other hand, is more flexible, it's adaptable. It's like a startup tech company where employees wear many hats. If a new problem comes up, the team quickly adapts, and instead of waiting for approval from a long chain of managers, they can tackle it. Neither system is inherently better, it just depends on the environment. Stable industries benefit from mechanistic. So think of again McDonald's. It's a company that's been around for many, many years. They can benefit from those mechanistic systems. And then you have like fast changing industries that could instead benefit from the organic structure and the organic system because they need to adapt. So it all depends on the business environment. So some of the common business structures are functional, product, geographic, and matrix. Functional structures group employees by their role. So we have here marketing, finance, HR. And product structures group them by product lines. So think of like iPhones, Macs, for Apple, like they're divided by their product lines. And then we have geographic, and these structures focus on regions. So, like fast food companies often operate this way. They'll adjust menus to local taste. So, like we talked about McDonald's, they will have a Big Mac on the menu, but then they'll have a lot of other menu items that are particular for that region that it operates in. And then we have matrix structure, and this one combines multiple approaches. It could be two approaches, or as an example, we have an engineer might report to both a project manager and a functional manager, depending on, the company and the industry and the project itself. So it creates flexibility, but can also cause confusion if managers give conflicting instructions. So if you're meeting with two different people and they're giving you mixed messages, that can be a little confusing for employees. Most companies use one of these structures. A product structure works well for a company like Apple with iPhones, iPads, Macs. They have a dedicated team working on each product. Geographic structure makes sense for a company like Walmart. They have to adapt to different regions. And then we have the matrix, which tries to balance both, but it can be a little bit complicated. And so that's pretty much how organizations are structured, but businesses won't necessarily stay the same forever. They change. And so it's important that as managers, you recognize when that change happens, when you change, how you adapt, all of that. So let's move into the second part of the chapter, which is organizational change. And let's first talk about what organizational change is, the type, and then we'll talk about the types of changes that can happen. So, organizational change is when a company shifts the way it works. It could be like how it operates, and it might change its structure, it might change technology, or maybe even like a culture. Sometimes it's planned, like when a company might reorganize or, maybe it's growing really fast and it needs to adjust and maybe redo its like org chart. But sometimes the growth is not planned. So think of COVID, right? When COVID happened, it really forced businesses to move remotely. It forced businesses to change how they operated completely overnight. And one of the famous examples that I like to talk about in the class is Netflix. It started as a DVD rental company, but then it shifted to streaming, and then its content creation wing started when it started making its own content, own movies, own shows. Blockbuster didn't take advantage of those changes. They resisted the change and they failed. So change is really hard for companies sometimes, but it's really necessary to survive. And think about all those companies that didn't adjust when COVID happened. What happened to them? And a lot of them went out of business. You see a lot of business, especially local businesses, that ended up closing. So it's really essential because the world continues to shift so much with things coming in like AI, video, remote work and video work. Just there's always shifts happening. Technology really exacerbates all of those shifts. And as businesses, you have to be able to adapt, whether it's people want to shop online, people want to try things on online. And as a business, you have to be able to adapt your organization. Maybe you start a wing that dedicates itself to creating digital tools for people to be able to try their clothes on online. Maybe they upload a picture of themselves. You can have the software to allow them to try on different articles of clothing. I mean, there's a ton of examples out there, but the key is that you identify how the industry, how your business is changing and what that means for the structure and the organization as a whole. So let's talk about the types of change. There are three main types of change. There's structural, technological, and cultural. Structural change is about reorganizing departments or reporting lines. So think of the org chart and changing that. As an example, we have Google when they created Alphabet as a parent company. That was a structural change. Technological change can mean adopting new systems, like think about when banks moved from in-person transactions to apps. So a lot of banks now have apps. They had to adapt. It's a technological shift. And then there's cultural shifts. This one is probably the hardest. It's about shifting values, shifting behaviors, shifting norms. So this one is probably one of the hardest for organizations and companies to adapt to. Like a company moving from a rigid 9 to 5 schedule to flexible remote work, that's a big shift right now for a lot of companies. So different types of changes that can occur, and How the company or organization responds and adapts to these changes determines whether they are successful. And so let's now shift to, we talked about change, what change is, the types of change that can happen. And now let's shift to talking about um, the different levels of change. Like some of them we talked about, like maybe creating an app for the way that your business operates. So some changes can be huge transformational changes, and some can be smaller. Like maybe we redo the org chart a little bit and shift a couple positions, you know. So some are small tweaks, some are huge total transformations that sometimes take a long time to implement. So there's different dimensions of change. When you're considering how to assess the need for change within an organization, it can be helpful to think of these three dimensions: scope, level, and intentionality. The first is the scope of change, and this is basically referring to the degree to which the change will disrupt the current patterns and routines. Incremental change is small refinements in the current structure and their practices and routines that might not challenge, but they can build and improve, and they're focused on, you know, doing this to existing aspects and practices within the organization. In contrast, you have transformational change, and that is significant, huge shifts within the organization, the system, and this transformational change can be very disruptive, can cause, you know, just a lot of delay, a lot of just chaos within the organization. So it's important to manage that transformational change really well. And then you have strategic change. This is a change. It doesn't matter if it's incremental or transformational. It just helps align an organization's operations with its mission and objectives. Then there's levels. There's individual, group, or organization-wide change. And then there's intentionality, planned versus unplanned. Intentionality is the final dimension of change and refers to the degree to which change is intentionally designed or purposely implemented. And that can be planned or unplanned. Some changes are carefully planned and others are forced. So we talked about COVID. Planned change might be like let's do a 5-year strategy or a 10-year strategy. And unplanned could be something like COVID, or think about like when there was like that chip shortage and it disrupts your supply chain or something. Understanding these dimensions helps managers prepare and respond effectively. But how do managers actually manage change? Managers have to guide change very carefully. Change management is the process of planning and implementing change in a very structured way. Organizational development, or OD, is about improving effectiveness by making planned and intentional changes. Think of organizational development as like giving the organization like regular checkups and a workout routine. It keeps the business healthy, fit, and ready for challenges. Managers use different models to guide the process, making it more likely that employees will accept and support those changes. The managers don't just come in and just hope for the best. They actually plan and they guide that change. There are several models that managers use to guide this process. So let's look at the most common change models. So there's psychologist Kurt Lewin's change model. He proposed this model, which shows organizational change occurring in three phases: unfreeze, change, and refreeze. Unfreezing means preparing people for change, like explaining why the old system doesn't work anymore and why the switch is happening. Change is the actual transition, introducing new systems or processes, how this change is happening. And then refreezing means solidifying the new way. So people don't slide back to the old habits or the old ways of doing things. So as an example, a company is moving from paper to digital payroll. First, you have to explain why paper checks are not efficient. You unfreeze, and then you roll out maybe a new digital system that the company is going to use. That's the change. And then finally, you provide training and reinforcements. Everyone uses the new system, they're trained in it, and they're now consistent in their use. So you refreeze the process. So it's this simple three-step model that, you know, basically builds that mental like perspective of how to think of the change. You unfreeze what they knew, you implement or share the processes or the change that's happening, and then refreeze into the new model or the new way of doing things. So this is a diagram of Lewin's change model that's in our textbook. You can see we have unfreeze, move, and refreeze. Unfreeze, change, which would be the move, and then the refreeze. So you can see here in the unfreeze section, you have examine status quo, increased driving forces for change, decreased resisting forces against. And then this is where the change, the move happens. You take action, make the changes, involve the people. And this is a really important piece because if you don't incorporate the people that are going to actually be implementing these changes, you want to help them be a part of the process because they're the ones that are ultimately going to be responsible for the success of this, change. And then you refreeze, you make the change permanent, you establish a new way of doing things, and you reward desired outcomes. So just a visual of Lewin's change model. Another popular model was developed by John Kotter. Kotter's change model is one of the most widely used in organizations today. His model provides more detail, especially for large-scale change. It starts with creating urgency for that change so that people understand why it's necessary. Then leaders build that guiding coalition, a strong team that's going to lead that change. And then they develop the vision to communicate it clearly to everyone so everyone's on board. Then they develop a vision and communicate it clearly to everyone involved. And then next, they empower action by removing obstacles and creating quick wins to build that momentum. And then finally, they reinforce the change by anchoring it in the culture, so in the actual company and organization culture. Starbucks used this approach when shifting towards sustainability. They built the urgency around climate change. They communicated their vision. They created early wins like recyclable cups, things like that before embedding the sustainability into their like full company long-term strategy. So managers can take these different theories and these different perspectives and really use them as a roadmap when they're in charge of implementing big change within their organizations. So, quick review and kind of key takeaways here. The big message is that structure and change are connected. Businesses have to be organized to function effectively, but they also have to be able to adapt quickly when things change. So, again, think of COVID. Leaders who understand both the structure and the change and how interconnected they are better equipped to help their organizations survive and thrive in uncertain environments. So remember that adaptability isn't just useful, it's required for the long-term success in today's business world. And that is it for chapter 10.